Titans. When it comes to PvE, Arc 3.0 doesn't appear to be flush with options at first glance. One of your aspects revolves completely around sprinting and getting a shield while you sprint, which is fine for defense, but we're looking for a bit more on the offensive side of things when it comes to PvE. Titans are going to be building in a way that is somewhat familiar to them based on some builds that we've seen in the past. This build is also pretty set in stone, save for some mod choices. There's a little bit of flexibility there, but for the most part, you're going to want to stick to the plan here, which is different from the Warlock build, where we got a little more flexibility. When it comes to aspects, we are essentially ruling out Juggernaut when it comes to offensive power. Juggernaut simply gives us a shield while sprinting, and while amplified, the shield is significantly stronger. You would think that this would be good for higher end content, and it has its moments, but for your average day-to-day stuff, you just don't need this effect at all. Not to mention that this build that we're going to be talking about is grenade focused. We aren't going to need to get up close to things. This leaves us with Touch of Thunder, which is what we're going to be building around today, and Knockout, which we will be able to take advantage of, even though it's not the main point of the build. Pretty simple compared to Warlocks. Touch of Thunder boosts 4 different grenades, but the one we're going to be using is Storm Grenade. This is because it gets to move around for a brief time, chasing down targets that might be just out of range, or maybe they teleport away, and it just deals a really solid amount of damage. Pulse Grenade is also not a bad choice if you know you'll be fighting more stationary targets, but for this video, let's stick with Storm. Fragment-wise, we want to focus our efforts on boosting grenades whenever possible. Unsurprisingly, Spark of Shock will make it into this build, as we will be using our grenade on cooldown. Spark of Ions will also make it into this build, as you should be jolting targets quite frequently, and this is doubly so if you're using a weapon with Volt Shot on it. Spark of Magnitude is likely to go into your build as well, increasing the duration of Storm Grenade, or Pulse if you decide to go that route. But the final fragment is up to you. Spark of Recharge will help bolster your cooldowns even more when you are critically hurt. Spark of Amplitude has a cooldown, but you'll be getting rapid kills very easily. Spark of Discharge works if you're using arc weapons. There's plenty to pick from, and you can choose something to fit your needs. Before we go into stats and mods, we need to pick an exotic to build around, and there are 2 that you can choose from: Armamentarium and Heart of Inmost Light, aka HOIL. Armamentarium is the exotic to pick if you don't want to work very hard. It simply gives you another grenade. There are no other effects, triggers, procs, nothing. Extra grenade, there you go. Heart of Inmost Light has only been getting more and more popular as the new Light 3.0 subclasses roll out, as this exotic is heavily based on being able to chain your abilities together, giving you massively reduced cooldowns and extra strength on your abilities. Using one ability boosts the other 2, and this can stack onto another ability a second time. So, for example, you use your melee to boost your barricade and your grenade. You use your barricade, which now has increased health because it was boosted, and using it boosts your grenade again, and then you use your grenade to have it deal much more damage. You can combine this with other mods that give you energy, like Impact Induction, Focusing Strike, stuff like that, stuff on your arms. Now, given everything that I just said about Heart of Inmost Light, HOIL, you might think that it's just the better choice. And for those who are willing to put in the effort with rotating their abilities and their cooldowns, I think it is. But 2 benefits from Armamentarium are, number 1, not having to think about any of that. And number 2, getting to use multiple grenades at the same time, which is much different than having to wind up one grenade with some bonus damage on it. We'll dive into what I think a good Arma build is when we get to that section. Stats wise, as you can imagine, we want as much grenade energy as possible. We will be using lightning strikes twice to bolster our grenade regeneration, but if you only kill 1, maybe 2 enemies with your grenade, it's still going to be a little bit of a wait before you get it back without wells or ionic traces flowing out consistently. I think maxing out your discipline isn't the worst idea, as you have complete freedom in how you wish to build after that, and because, you know, the entire build revolves around grenades. So I would go at the minimum tier 8. Resilience and recovery are still very strong as stats. Those are always good. You could opt for some decent strength as well, depending on how often you think you're going to be using your melee based on your playstyle and your exotic selection. But if you just want to keep it simple, focus on discipline and then secondary, resilience, and recovery. This brings us to mods, and this is going to be the biggest part of the build process, as there are many options. We're going to start with the most basic, which is an elemental well generating build. 2 elemental ordnance, bountiful wells, seeking wells. That's a pretty good starting spot. This is literally just, I make wells when I kill stuff with grenades, and then those wells come to me and they give me energy. That's it. That's the whole thing. More energy, so you can just get back to throwing grenades or using abilities. You could swap Seeking Wells with Overcharged Wellmaker for more on-demand wells, or with Font of Might for some extra arc weapon damage. However, we can take this a step farther. Explosive Wellmaker works with Storm Grenade. Don't ask me why. So throwing that into the mix with 2 Elemental Ordnance mods and Bountiful Wells can result in 1 grenade giving an Ionic Trace, 3 Arc Wells, and 2 Solar Wells, with the Solar Wells only coming with rapid kills, which is 2 kills, by the way, only 2. And you still have room for another mod. How about Well of Life for some extra healing? Maybe Well of Ordnance, keep it simple, more energy. I know that Solar Wells are only going to generate energy for one of your abilities if you're on an Arc subclass, but it's still free energy, and it's pretty satisfying to see a bunch of wells fly out of enemies. We also have an energy converter build, which should boost our super energy gains dramatically when used under optimal conditions. Charged up, supercharged energy converter, probably stacks on stacks as well, along with taking charge. If you do go this route, I would highly recommend a helmet mod that generates orbs of power on weapon kills, harmonic, kinetic, or an elemental siphon mod, whichever one you want to use. If you find that you're making enough orbs of power through the use of Spark of Amplitude, you can skip the Siphon mod. You could also potentially skip on stacks if you're making and collecting enough orbs. But with this build, in particular, you only need 3 orbs of power to get 5 stacks of Charged with Light. You pop your Thunder Crash, you throw a grenade, and then you get half of your super energy back immediately, and then you just start the chain over and over again. The negatives about this build are, number 1, it's very expensive in terms of energy costs, and it requires 2 Void and 2 Solar armor pieces specifically, which may interfere with other builds you may have. And 2, you lack elemental well generation for your abilities, so I would probably push towards HOIL if I was going to go with this build. We have the equivalent of an energy converter build, but for your grenade instead of your super via the Firepower mod. 3x Firepower will get you half of your grenade back after you use your grenade when you're charged with light. We can either add a 4th to dial that up even more and then use Taking Charge, or we can stick to 3, which is probably enough, and do Elemental Charge and Elemental Ordnance, making wells on grenade kills, which when picked up is converted into Charged with Light. You still have room on your class item to throw on Lightning Strikes twice into the mix as well. You can also combine these setups instead of going all in on one thing. The benefit is obviously that you can be affected by multiple mods with multiple effects, but the negatives are having those effects not be as strong, or having to juggle multiple effects on top of having to juggle Heart of Inmost Light if you end up going with that. For example, Elemental Charge and Elemental Ordnance to get Charged with Light, and then peppering in some other Charged with Light mods. Maybe you're running with Brigand's Law, the sidearm, which can get Volt Shot, and you want to go with Surprise Attack to boost your sidearm stuff. I don't really recommend going in on multiple Charged with Light mods that consume charge, like Surprise Attack and Firepower at the same time, although that's probably one of the less egregious combinations you could do. Worrying yourself about trying to proc too many things can really take the fun out of the game, which is why for most people I'd say, keep it simple. While I suppose there's no harm in chasing a striking light build, this kind of strays away from the main point of the build. I mentioned this in the Warlock video, but just in case you didn't watch that, I didn't include trace evidence in this video because according to some of my testing for that video, It doesn't appear to be working correctly or like at all in some cases. If it ever starts working properly during the season, I think it would be reasonable to swap it with Lightning Strikes Twice, or at least try it out. But I, at the moment, think of the two mods as basically equals. Lightning Strikes Twice is also not desperately needed. I would suggest using it this season, and something's better than nothing, but it won't be needed to see this build succeed, which means this build will have life going into future seasons without Arc mods. Why do I like this build? Well, where certain parts of the Warlock build failed, this build succeeded. This build is capable of both good AoE ad clear and single target champion damage thanks to your improved and longer duration storm grenades. In your average day-to-day content, this build is probably complete overkill, especially if you're using HOIL. I don't think you will have enough things to really kill to combo out, and if you do, it's not going to be that much of a combo. It's going to be using your wall, and then a grenade, and then hopefully a melee if everything's not completely dead, and then you move on. But Heart of Inmost Light is really what takes this build to the next level, as it allows you to chain your abilities pretty near endlessly as long as you're actually hitting with your melee and your grenade. Even just popping a wall up in a random spot will boost the regeneration rate of your other abilities, which means a lot less downtime waiting for things to come back. In terms of your melee attack, I was originally going to say avoid Thunderclap in endgame content because of how it works. You need to stand still, and you're just a sitting duck while it's happening. But when it comes to comboing with Heart of Inmost Light, this is actually one of the fastest and safest melees out of everything Titan has. Seismic Strike has a big wind-up, and you need to be point blank, and Ballistic Slam is basically the same. Big wind-up, and then diving into a crowd of enemies. Thunderclap has a wind-up, but if you want to use it instantly, to just use your melee attack to proc Heart of Inmost Light, you have that option, and you don't need to be point blank to tag something. Also, because of the ability to charge the actual melee attack before using it, you can deal some decent damage to champions on a full charge. I'm 15 levels under in this Master Law sector, and this build is doing some serious work with Heart of Inmost Light and a generic well generation build with Seeking Wells. The grenade is able to wipe out entire groups of enemies without a lot of effort, especially since the storm grenade just tracks everything in the room, plus you have Jolt going on at the same time. While it's not exactly the same minus 20 I was in the Warlock video, or even close to the minus 25 that GM Nightfalls are, I'm still pretty confident in Storm Grenade's ability to wipe out low-tier enemies in those activities. Dregs, Vandals, Acolytes, Legionnaires, yada yada. Because the grenade lasts such a long time. And again, you're also getting that Jolt effect. Might take a second longer for that kill to lock in, but it's gonna happen. But you also get the benefit, again, of jolting bigger targets via Spark of Shock, which enables you to shoot a big target after it's been hit by Jolt, and then AoE down all other enemies nearby, which is just awesome to be able to do. It's very reminiscent of Warlock's Starfire Protocol build, where you get to throw grenades at a big target, and the Ignite explosions kill stuff around the big target that you're already dealing damage to. It's great. But let's not count out Armamentarium, as I tested that as well at 17 levels under. Using a generic well build and generic weapons, I was ready to call this battle well in favor of Heart of Inmost Light. But then, I switched to the Firepower build and a weapon with Demolitionist, and I was very impressed at the output. This wasn't even fully optimized either. At least I feel like I could have eked out a few more percentage points somewhere. Double Storm Grenades were getting Overload champions to more or less 5 to 10% health on their own, but you should still shoot them to stop them from regenerating their health. What I did enjoy about this setup is that using your weapon was incentivized via Demolitionist. If I ever ran out of grenade energy, then my best choice was to simply shoot things with my gun. I feel like in a lot of other builds, most of the time, you don't really want to lose your combo, so you just sort of stand around waiting for abilities to come back. But with this particular build, it felt nice to be like, oh, I can shoot things and it doesn't mess with my combo. In fact, it actually helps. Now, in this particular Lost Sector, I did have 50% bonus damage on my pulse rifle, so I was able to kill things with this weapon much faster than usual. But the concept of having my weapon actually be a benefit to the build was nice, versus some builds that are completely ability driven. However, one of the main downfalls of this version of the build is that you need to manually go get elemental wells to be able to spam grenades. If you're in a situation like, say, this one, where the boss gets 50% bonus damage and can basically two-shot you, getting close to pick up elemental wells from enemies that you killed nearby is very risky. And a lot of the time, enemies were near the boss, making it very difficult to grab these wells. You could swap out one firepower for a seeking wells, though, to counteract this negative. You just won't get as much energy back from using firepower, but some is certainly better than none. However, we should look at some opportunity costs. Using this build versus using something like Lorelei Solar Titan or just a generic Void Titan, is this worth using over one of those two other builds in Grandmaster Nightfalls, for example? For people who are very comfortable with Titan or endgame content, there is certainly a place for it. But for those still trying to get into GMs for the first time, I would definitely push people towards something more defensive in nature. But this build works amazingly well in content that's just on the edge of getting very tough, right in that 10 to 15, maybe even 20 levels under range. I will be giving this build a try in GMs this season though, and I will try to report back. That is the Titan build of the season, I think, for Arc. I'd love to explore Titans a bit more as time goes on, but I think this is primarily what you're going to be seeing from Arc Titans at the moment. Titans playing around with Touch of Thunder and all that, especially since it's very easy to combo, and Storm Grenades are very, very strong when enhanced. Thank you very much for watching. I will see you next time.